Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So here I am outside the Grand Hotel Imperial at Santa Maria Ligure, Portofino in Italy. So it's called Santa Maria Ligure because there are many towns in Italy called Santa Maria to distinguish it, because we're in Liguria, this region very close to France. Anyway, I'm filming here because at this hotel on the 16th of April 1922 the Rapallo Pact was signed. That's important if you're doing history GCSE. So the Russian and German delegations met here to thrash out a few issues. They had been at the Genoa conference just down the coast and met with several other countries, the United States, France, to try to settle issues arising from the First World War, which had ended only 4 years earlier. Well, not even. And the Germans were unhappy that they were not getting any moratorium on their reparations repayments. The Allies said, no, you must pay the full amount on schedule. And the Russians they weren't getting any joy either. France was demanding that the new communist government in Russia assume responsibility for the debts of Tsarist Russia. Now, as Moscow pointed out, this was decidedly hypocritical of Paris, because after the French Revolution, revolutionary France had repudiated the debts of the former monarchy. And they were, obviously the Russians were going by that same legal principle. So then there was the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic at the time. The Soviet Union wasn't founded as such until December that year, proclaimed from the stage of the Bolshoi Theatre in Moscow. So anyway, the German delegation and the Russian delegation came down the coast here and signed the Rapallo Pact. We call it Rapallo Pact even though it's not actually Rapallo. We're one railway station away from there. So they agreed to drop all claims for compensation arising from the First World War, to re-establish diplomatic relations which had been severed in August 1914 upon the outbreak of hostilities, and to resume commercial relations. They both badly needed trade. The German business community saw some golden opportunities for commerce in Russia. Obviously the Russian economy was in tatters after 4 years of devastation from the First World War and the Russian Civil War. There were secret annexes to this where they then began military cooperation. Remember, pursuant to the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not permitted to have an air force or a general staff. It was allowed to have no submarines, no poison gas, a very limited army, and only 36 warships, only 6 of which would be battleships, all of a limited size. So they sent their troops to the Soviet Union, and they trained in these weapons which they were actually forbidden. Now, both of them vehemently denied that this was going on, but of course it was going on. Now, in this, the Soviets almost sowed the seeds of their own destruction, because some of these German officers and soldiers who trained in the Soviet Union later attacked it in 1941, and had been an opportunity for espionage. They understood how the Soviet army worked, and so on. So that is the Rapallo Pact, and the German Chancellor Wirth was here at the time. Krestinsky for the Soviets was here. Georgy Chicherin was the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs. That's like Foreign Minister. Now the communists or Bolsheviks, they didn't like using the word the government minister because they felt that was bourgeois. They were a people's government. This was for the working class and so on. Leon Trotsky had been the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs sometime a little bit earlier. So you see, it's in the decidedly unproletarian confines of this magnificent hotel it was signed, but obviously it's been closed because of coronavirus. And they then had to ratify in both countries. Now, the Soviet Union, being a one-party state, had no difficulty doing that. If you didn't sign it, you may well be going to the Gulag. Walter Rathenau, a German chap who signed it also on behalf of the German Republic, he brought it back, and it was ratified with rather more difficulty by the Reichstag. He was assassinated sometime later. He was a Jewish chap as well, partly anti-Semitism, partly having signed this Rapallo Pact, as in they weren't trying to get any compensation out of Russia, trying to rebuild relations with them. So these two countries, they were lepers at the time. They were outcasts. Germany for having been on the losing side of the First World War, so the Soviet Union, well, as it was, Russian Soviet Socialist Federative Republic, which was the nucleus of the Soviet Union, for being a communist state, wasn't recognized as a legitimate government by many countries. Some of them still recognized the white government of Russia, as in the anti-communist government of Russia, which had fled, but didn't manage to set up an effectual, even government in exile. Alexander Kerensky, the last prime minister of that white government, he just stopped even bother calling himself Prime Minister, and he moved to the Soviet Union. Moved to the United States. Never set foot in his birthplace again. Then it was, as I say, ratified by the two countries. They had a chance to change their mind, that's to say denounce it. They didn't do so, and then in Berlin, some months later, they exchanged these documents of ratification. There was another annex to it signed in 1923. So that is the Rapallo Pact. Well, what else can I say? Obviously rather costly to come here, living in opulence, and communists are supposed to be egalitarian, be unmaterialistic, and not wanting to luxuriate, especially while many of their people were starving to death back then. So the treaty also said this treaty pertained to the lands which were soon Serbian to Russia, because the communist government in Russia had believed in national self-determination. So the non-Russian portions of the empire, if they wished to proclaim independence, so this shall be respected. And indeed, Russia recognized the lawful independence of Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, but then invaded them all within a few years, reneged on that. And then there were other examples of this. Obviously, Finland invaded in 1939, and Central Asia. There'd been a big rebellion in Central Asia in 1916 during the First World War, and it took 20 years before the Russians fully controlled Central Asia. Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, and then created these. Bizarrely, most of Kazakhstan was briefly in Kyrgyzstan, and then they reorganized it in the 1930s. So Kazakhstan was largely a Russian creation. There was a small horde, the Middle Horde and the Great Horde and the Golden Horde, and the Russians simply decided that they were one. They were Kazakhs, even though they all had different dialects, arguably different languages. And the Russians more or less at random picked one of those as the official version of Kazakh. They sometimes refer to the area as Turkestan. So they moved borders, they deliberately moved people, they gave an ethnic Tajik area to Uzbekistan, and things like that. And they took an ethnically Turkmen area and put part of Tajikistan, even though it's surrounded by Kyrgyzstan, and made it incredibly complicated. Gave some Azerbaijani territory to Georgia, gave some Armenian territory to Azerbaijan, and moved people as well. Moved these people out of their homelands. Moved Russians and Ukrainians in to try and make the breakup of the Soviet Union as difficult as possible. As we now know, it didn't make it impossible, but it made it extremely messy in the 90s, and it lasts to this day with that frozen conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or in Georgia, South Ossetia, illegally occupied by Russia, and Moscow treats the United Nations as completely irrelevant to an international dispute, and the Russian occupiers there pretend to be peacekeepers when of course they attacked Georgia. And likewise in Abkhazia, same thing, illegal occupation by Moscow, and not regarding it as something which is germane to the United Nations. And this is precisely what the United Nations for is: peacekeeping and dealing with these border disputes, or indeed occupying Transnistria, part of the territory of Moldova. And other any more examples? Well, obviously Donbass and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine, or indeed Crimea. Okay, that's enough for me here in Santa Maria de Liguria, this glorious resort town, which is just so inimitably Italian, with these often salmon pink walls and things like that. For some reason, the only thing that's uniform is shutters are always olive green, I've noticed. Okay, I'll turn it off now. Toodle pip.